Hello, my name is David Day, and I'm a professor at the University of Western Australia Business School. I'm here at the USB Leaders Angle, providing a talk on the state of the art in the science and practice of leadership development, focusing on what we know from evidence and from theory around what works with leadership and leadership development. An edited version of my talk follows. But I have three basic questions around leadership. Given that this is a public lecture, I'm not assuming that people have deep understandings of the academic side of leadership or leadership development. So I thought I'd start with some broader questions. And one of the most common question I am asked, are leaders born or are they made? You know, is it genetics, is it inherited, or is it something that's developed? And there's been research that's been done on this that shows that, in fact, it is both. But with this notion of are leaders born or made, you get into what I call the romance of leadership. Just give me this white stallion of a job, of a role, and I will ride off and be the successful leader. The reality of leadership is that it takes a lot of work. The second question that I get asked a lot is, can anyone be a leader? And I think the answer is everyone must be a leader, even if they can't be the leader. And this comes from Peter Drucker, who said, in the traditional organization, the organization of the last 100 years, the skeleton or internal structure was a combination of rank and power. In the emerging organization, it has to be mutual understanding and responsibility. So this notion of building commitments, of mutual understanding and responsibility, is core to the 21st organization. Most people go through their lives using no more than a small fraction of their potential within them. The reservoir of unused human talent is vast, and learning to tap that reservoir more effectively is one of the exciting tasks ahead for humankind. Third question, is leadership the only real training for leadership? So what do we know after 100+ years of leadership research? And again, this is more about leadership, but it informs the development piece. It requires a social interaction among leaders, followers, and situations. All three of those are important components in leadership. There is no right or wrong leadership theory. We need to get beyond that. Those wars are still going on. Is it authentic leadership? Is it transformational leadership? Is it servant leadership? Is it what adjective leadership style are we talking about? They're all right to some extent, none perfectly so. It can originate from many different sources. And again, it goes back to this notion of how much of potential around leadership is wasted by focusing only on people in particular roles, and the organizational, especially a corporate practice, of focusing on high potential leaders. And leaders develop through experience, especially on-the-job experience, but it's not just providing people with experiences, it's helping them learn from those experiences. The state of the art in leadership development does not take people away from their work to develop. I'm a big fan of feedback. And I think feedback is something that's a big lever in terms of helping people learn from their experience. Back to this notion of why the practice of leadership development might be considered to be broken by senior leaders. One is a lack of understanding of what is the nature of leadership development. What is it exactly? There's different levels of analysis. Leadership development tends to be really about developing individual leaders. But we're learning more about developing leadership in a collective fashion. Time frames. People who invest in leadership development tend to think in very short-term kinds of mechanisms. But really, it's a long-term investment. The lack of theory to guide investments in leadership development. Where are these theories? Until recently, there haven't been many or any. The focus has been around leadership theories. And what's the evidence? Training versus development is an important issue that gets into a little bit into the time frame issue, but it's also about how do you approach developing leaders and leadership from a practical perspective. Training is providing proven solutions to known problems, and this is really a leadership competency approach, which is very popular in organizations. I think there are two issues with this that undermine its effectiveness. One is that they tend to be backward-looking rather than forward-looking. And the other one is that they tend to be given the stamp of approval from people at senior positions who say, yeah, this is the competency that made me successful, so this is what we should be teaching all of our aspiring leaders. In terms of the theory, this is, I think, the implicit theory or the naive theory that a lot of organizations have around leadership development. You have some sort of initiative, whether it's a program, whether it's a practice, whether it's an intervention, and then that leads to leadership effectiveness. Here's some evidence around these things, around what develops in leader development. And this comes from some descriptive research that was done by MBA professors out at Stanford University, Benjamin and Pfeffer, who interviewed, I think, 75 or so of their MBA students to ask them about what are common leadership challenges they are facing as they are emerging in their leadership journey. And they organized them around leading self and leading others. So leading organizations is something that usually comes about more in senior level positions. So I'm going to talk mostly about leading self and leading others. This notion of developing a leadership mindset, understanding yourself as a leader. It becomes less and less about you and more about others around you. Leaders don't really accomplish anything. Things get done through the so-called followers. Coping with setbacks and disappointments, the notion of resilience, and also balancing pressures that you have from multiple points of origin, including work and family. Now, in terms of leading others, it's this notion of motivating subordinates, especially subordinates who have very different values than you. And then finally, managing relationships, which gets into this notion again of social capital. So if we look at what we should be developing for leaders, and especially emerging leaders, are things to help them cope with these challenges. So when we talk about developing leaders, we should look to these proximal developmental indicators as things that are showing the way that more long-term development may be happening. Something that gets overlooked is that leader development happens in the course of ongoing adult development. Psychological safety deals with the feeling of trust in an interpersonal context to be able to take an interpersonal risk. Can I express my ignorance with my colleagues and not be ridiculed? So here are a few principles around leader development. What we need to think more of is in terms of proactive experience shaping. You know, experiences are things that we have control of over to some extent. What experiences can we shape or put ourselves into where we can be challenged and where we can learn? This notion of practice. Practice is important, and self-reflection and feedback are crucial to learning and development. These are things that don't cost anything, really. Any experience can be made more developmental to the extent that they include these three things. Assessment, some understanding of where you are now, whether it's in terms of your skills, your competencies, your mindset, your personality, whatever. The challenge to do things differently, to develop, to learn. And having the support, the interpersonal support, to continue with that over the long term are really the touchstones of developmental experiences. A lot of what happens in leader development is not visible. What we see at the surface level is really around skills and competencies, and these can be measured. But what supports those skills and competencies are less visible. This is leader identity, leader self-regulation processes. Thinking of yourself as a leader leads you to look for opportunities to practice your leadership. Practicing your leadership will make you more likely to be effective when a leadership opportunity arises, which further supports this development of a leader identity. Becoming a leader, what does that really take? And it's tied into becoming a leader in terms of people's careers as well as their personal leadership journeys. And we tend to think about career ladders much as we think about developmental ladders, that it's a scaffolding kind of thing where people climb rung by rung by rung from being a manager trainee up to vice president, senior level leader, or whatever. Careers are not like this. Development is not like this. Rising to being an institutional leader, running a business, a company, a school, is not straight up. It's more like going up a mountain that involves a series of 135-degree switchbacks. And the higher you go on this particular journey, the less it is about you. It's really going from an individual to a relational to a collective kind of perspective. So what is this shared leadership? It offers different forms of collective capacity, and it really runs on a continuum from something that's very centralized to something that's very decentralized. And think about this in terms of informal rather than formal structures. This is an academic, as you can tell, an academic slide, but I think it's very helpful in understanding what different forms of leadership might look like. If you look at the top one, what you notice, and notice that it incorporates 5 people. If you look at what's called centralized leadership, you see that A is always in the middle, right? A influences E, D, C, B, but E, D, C, B don't influence A, right? Is this model wrong? No. It's often right. It's often what we need. And we need this, for example, when the leader, when A knows exactly what needs to be done. So look at the next one, which is distributed leadership, which it's virtually the same as what's happening in centralized leadership, except who is the leader changes across time. This could be an effective leadership structure if you wanted to develop leadership capabilities in A, B, and C. Now, here's what you get into shared leadership. And as you notice, it's completely saturated. Everybody is influencing everybody else, and it's reciprocal. Now, this is getting into a much more inclusive approach to leadership. It's been argued that this form is becoming more necessary. But the thing is with this, it just doesn't happen. You just can't say, boom, here, go do shared leadership. It needs to be nurtured and developed so that when it is necessary, you can rely on it. Now, this last one, people tend to think is bad. Leadership void. There's no leadership going on here. You know, there's nobody influencing anybody else. And sometimes you don't need leadership. It's shocking, isn't it? Sometimes you don't need leadership if the context provides what leaders and leadership normally do. I mean, there's an area of research around work design. So if you design work in such a way that it's meaningful to people, they get feedback, they know what to do, you don't need leadership. In closing, what I think we need is to have integrative developmental systems. And one of the challenges is linking this notion of individual development with more collective leadership development. So I want to leave you with this quote from John Gardner, who I'm a fan of, in his leadership book on leadership. If you haven't read it, it's definitely worth a read. We have barely scratched the surface in our efforts toward leadership development. In the mid-21st century, which is coming up quickly, people will look back on our present practices as primitive. So with that, I say thank you, and we have a few minutes for question time. Thank you.